Que lo que mi gente, I am Carlos Egaña. I'm a Brooklyn-based Venezuelan writer. Some would also say I'm a political activist or community organizer. I earned my MFA in creative writing in Spanish at New York University, and I am currently a high school teacher and have taught at the college level in the past as well. It is an immense honor to be here. So, I have been asked by my friends from Versopolis to lead a class on how poetry can be a tool for self-expression, activism, and collective work within communities. I am, after all, a poet that has actively participated in the struggle for Venezuela's freedom, as well as in community projects both back home in Caracas and in New York City, where I currently live. But in these days of populism, polarization, and cruelty, I've concluded while preparing this lesson that it might be more worthwhile to cheat a little bit and focus on poetry's ties to current day politics, not just as a tool for hope, but also for destruction. First, nonetheless, we must ask ourselves, is poetry even useful at all? Does it have a function besides allowing us to escape from our daily ills, besides moving us to reflect upon ourselves through well-knit sentences and powerful imagery? There's a quote by American writer Ben Lerner from his book, The Hatred of Poetry, that I find particularly thrilling regarding this question. It goes, what if we dislike or despise or hate poems because they are, every single one of them, failures? The poet and critic Alan Grossman tells a story. There are many versions of the story that goes like this. You're moved to write a poem because of some transcendent impulse to get beyond the human, the historical, the finite. But as soon as you move from that impulse to the actual poem, the song of the infinite is compromised by the finitude of its terms. So the poem is always a record of failure. Fascinating, right? Indeed, writers of all genres frequently face this frustration. Staring at the computer screen while you delete and type and delete and retype the same idea, hoping that it will finally become the sentence that most closely resembles what's on your mind. And as for poet activists or poet warriors, this can be quite harrowing, especially because poetry requires a consciousness of the form, of stringing words together in a way that goes beyond mere communication, as more central or equally important as the substance of what is written, especially because suspecting that what you're writing won't have any material effect on what you're fighting for is not just common, but oftentimes evident. Consider the poem Dos Patrias by José Martí, the Cuban national hero, who, as many Latin Americans actively involved in politics, lived a good chunk of his life in exile. As translated by Ilan Stavans, in English it goes, I have two homelands, Cuba and the night, or are they one and the same? No sooner does His Majesty the sun retire than Cuba with long veils and a carnation in hand, silent like a sad widow, appears before me. I know that bleeding carnation trembling in her hand. It's empty. My chest is destroyed and empty where the heart once was. It's time to begin dying. The night is right to say goodbye. The light is bothersome and the word is human. The universe speaks better than man. Like a flag inviting us to battle, the candle's red flame flickers. I open the windows, overwhelmed inside, mute, plucking the carnation's leaves like a cloud darkening the sky. Cuba, a widow, passes by. Seems to me that for Martí, the consciousness of failure, both of the poet who wants to translate his innermost worries into language as the ellipsis that we can't hear, but we can see when we see the poem in paper, at the end of the poem implies, as well as of the fighter who yearns for a grander nation at distance, is clear. The consciousness of failure is clear. And like Martí, we can find this sentiment in the works of other folks who have had similar profiles. The melancholy verses of Mahmoud Darwish immediately come to mind. So, is poetry simply a diversion for those who strive for change? Something akin to jotting your most difficult thoughts and desires in a diary you keep under your bed? Why teach this lesson at all if that's the case? Well, perhaps poetry in itself might not be the best motor for change. Seems to me like essays and nonfiction books are usually the basis of socio-political movements and strategies to organize society. Consider Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and the Last Man, Judith Butler's Gender Trouble. No matter what you think of these books' contexts, their impact on society is quite tangible. But what about Socrates? What about his warnings about poets? As written in the Republic, poetry feeds and waters the passions instead of drying them up. She lets them rule. Per Socrates, the poet is potentially dangerous and should not participate in matters of the state. He awakens and nourishes and strengthens the feelings and impairs the reason. And I think this idea, which I find quite thrilling and more adequate toward times than some may think, deserves a good dose of attention, with a degree of nuance, of course. Perhaps poets are not as negative as Socrates frames, but perhaps poetry has the power he implies. Consider the rhetoric and logic that has overtaken politics in the last decade or so, that has cast the neoliberal technocratic understanding of what is good government as a treasonous way of governing. I am talking, of course, about populism. Now, I don't intend here to say whether populism is bad or good. It is a tool that can lead to successful or unsuccessful governance. In any case, if we go over some of populism's elements per Ernesto Laclau's writings, we can see that A, it frames political struggle as a conflict between a people and an elite. B, it requires an empty or floating signifier, an image, a concept, a motto that can be interpreted in various manners, therefore putting together the beliefs and needs of different communities into one desire for radical change. And C, it places affective phenomena, anger, resentment, but also joy in the foreground of politics, not necessarily as more important than reason, but perhaps as equally important. Do you see where I'm getting here? Populist politicians are not usually poets or have not participated in the field of literature at all, but often they have used the mechanisms of poetry to rally people in their favor, to construct an empty or floating signifier that awakes the feelings and passions of many to get them to the polls or the streets. Let's think, for example, about the potency behind anaphoras, alliteration, rhythm, about metaphors, of course, as well. Take the famous I Have a Dream speech from Martin Luther King Jr., who, per a text by organizer and academic Harry Boite, once said, "I've always identified with populism." Many, not just Americans, know the most memorable part of the speech by heart.
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia,
which goes, "I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right down in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. The repetition of I have a dream at the beginning of each statement, a perfect example of the poetic device anaphora, talks directly to one of our least tangible feelings, an invisible element that makes us irremediably human. Hope, by insisting on this dream, which could be our dream. He doesn't just describe what an ideal future that would put the democratic demands of many together as a mere lecture. He moves us to share his position and to pay extra attention to what he and we ourselves, if we submit to his hypnotic repetition, wants for the world. Take as another example the Trumpist motto, Make America Great Again. The way these letters tangle with each other, say it again more slowly, even if you find it off-putting as I do. Make America Great Again makes the sentence they form quite easy to remember, to digest, to inspire. This case of alliteration puts the form of what is said, the rhythm, the way it sounds, before the substance. Many might believe that America was better in the past. Others might find this idea inaccurate. It was great for who, they might ask. But one thing is true. This phrase is quite memorable and allows many folks who have been disenfranchised by contemporary America's failures to find in it a reflection of their nostalgia, to find in it a calling to make, to do, instead of just to wait and see. Consider another Trumpist concept, that of draining the swamp. This quite evocative metaphor, which suggests that others, that those who govern are, well, disgusting, quite powerfully separates those who agree with the speaker as a people opposed to a damning and damned elite. Through poetic compression, this suggestive idea, after all, who wouldn't want to live in a cleanish place, captures the attention of those that feel contaminated by rulings that do not benefit them. And as the previous motto, motivates these folks to act, whichever that action may be. While going over all these examples, I can't help but also think of an infamous quote from Venezuelan poet Luis Alberto Crespo, a very talented man who sold his soul to the movement that has obliterated my country. He once said, ser poeta no es escribir poemas, es crear poesía. Hugo Chávez es el gran poeta de Venezuela. That is to say, to be a poet is not to write poetry, it's to create poetry. Hugo Chávez is the great poet of Venezuela. I wouldn't dare say that Chavez was a poet or glaze him that way, especially when so many Venezuelan writers like Rafael Cadenas or the late Millo Estrini have consciously dedicated their inner turmoil and political commitment into sincere, beautiful verses. But Chavez's hour-long speeches certainly use poetry to foster feelings of rage and community. Whenever we stop and listen to his rhetorical mastery with attention, it makes sense why, despite all the damage he did to my country, Chavez remained popular amongst his base until his death. And as I go over this, I can't help but think of Noam Chomsky's concept of generative grammar, the idea that our brains have an innate set of rules that allows us to grasp and produce language in a structured manner, that allows us to intuitively understand how syntax works. I have no proof, but few doubts that we have a similar set of unconscious knowledge of literary devices and of how to react to their effective usage. That we have a generative poetics of sorts, an intuitive sense, I insist, of how to react when the poetic function shows up in everyday speech or in political discourse. So poetry might be a register of failure from a literary perspective, from the standpoint of a small god or an architect of words, but poetic devices, even detached from art, or perhaps especially detached from art, are tremendously effective political instruments. They move crowds and sculpt emotions, something that mere reason and condescending poker faces might not do, especially nowadays. Now, if we take Martin Luther King Jr. out of the list of examples I just gave, we might conclude uh, that the political potency of poetry leads to division and cruelty. The cadence and mastery of metaphor building of populist or populisty leaders have justified persecution in the hearts of many. But just as populism can be fueled on emotions that are against something or someone, leaders can use its communicative logic to direct communities in pro of something or someone, even if it's necessary to point to an elite as the reason folks that are marginalized in one way or another are, well, marginalized. It's not the same to call on the destruction of a few to find some sort of happiness than to call on their mercy to insist that they should share or give others an opportunity to do what they failed in doing, right? This instead of something more perhaps capricious. It's not the same also to frame the half of a community as those to blame for our suffering, that is to say, to actively polarize, than to pinpoint with eloquence who should correct their ways and why. Consider Zoran Mamdani's campaign for New York City mayor. While he pinpoints the greed of billionaires as a cause behind how unaffordable the city is, his speeches are more geared towards an idea of solidarity that encompasses the many wide array of communities the city has, a quite powerful move in a time where the Democratic Party has explicitly segmented the population it supposedly caters to in gender and racial groups, thus preventing a common front to be formed, thus generating barriers and skepticism amongst these groups. Zoran instead talks to all of us and finds her differences to be not something we should be especially careful about, but the basis of a plural community that can be one community. Isn't that the effect of the, or let's say the effect that the emphatic anaphora-laden idea he mentioned in his victory speech, the idea that New York will remain a city of immigrants, a city built by immigrants, powered by immigrants, and as of tonight, led by an immigrant. When in that same speech, he insisted that our greatness will be anything but abstract. It will be felt by every rent-stabilized tenant who wakes up on the first of every month, knowing the amount they're going to pay hasn't soared since a month before. It will be felt by each grandparent who can afford to stay in the home they have worked for and whose grandchildren live nearby because the cost of childcare didn't send them to Long Island. Isn't the intersection in this part of this speech of poetry and populist rhetoric a more responsible, forward-looking one? Hopefully, Mamdani will keep this tone and try to achieve his proposals in power. Hopefully, he won't betray his promises, as many other populist politicians have done. In any case, the grassroots quality of Mamdani's campaign, of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s in America, show that poetic devices can mobilize not just from a top-down manner, not just from resentment, but from relatively horizontal ones too. Leaders, of course, are always necessary for our movement to succeed. And although leaders are not necessarily poets by trade, poets can certainly participate and lead in these movements to ensure their fullest success. Perhaps the main takeaway we can have from these minutes of me babbling and shaking and babbling is that you, oh young poet who participates in politics, not just because your work is inevitably political, as every work of art, I believe, is, but because you literally work in the political sphere as an organizer, activist, congressman, congresswoman, state employee, etc., you have a responsibility to your language. Your skills are a privilege of sorts. Not everyone has a mastery over literary tropes. And that privilege comes, of course, with responsibility. Having privilege is not necessarily a bad thing, right? The problem is what we do with it. We can't just simply cast it aside. It's quite easy to put our skills in the service of polarization, of cruelty, the worst consequence of populism driven by the worst type of suspicion. It is perhaps easier to wield language as a sword instead of a bridge, to dehumanize through metaphor. But a passionate and compassionate use of the tools that make something poetic can also dignify, illuminate, and reunite. It can remind us that the people are not a mob, but a collection of voices. It can allow us to help the people become, indeed, a plural collection of voices. So do not underestimate your talents and be aware of the temptation the abyss that stares at us poses. This world might seem rotten at first glance. Our words might contaminate it even more if wielded without care. May we all be eager to recognize when our tools are being used to destroy, and may we responsibly lead or assist those in pain with our rhetorical and symbolic proficiency to make the material conditions of our existence more prosperous, more equal, and more uplifting. Muchísimas gracias por escucharme. Thank you so much for hearing me out. That's it.